How's it going, Panthers? I'm Ingrid Lee reporting for BRJL 103. Today, I am joined by Rowena Chiu, a recognized activist of the hashtag #MeToo movement, a victim of the Weinstein Scandal in 1998, and is portrayed in the film She Said, coming out Friday, November 18th. So, Rowena, I know you have been very vocal and open about what has happened regarding the Weinstein scandal, but originally you had actually signed an NDA or non-disclosure agreement regarding your encounter with Harvey Weinstein during that night. What were your thoughts when you signed the document?
Yes, absolutely. I worked for Harvey Weinstein in 1998, and at that time I was 24. I didn't work for Harvey for very long before I was assaulted, only about 2 months. And once I was assaulted, the other assistant Zelda and I went back to London and we resigned our positions. And from there, we were very quickly pulled into a negotiation for a non-disclosure agreement, otherwise known as an NDA. My thoughts on signing the NDA. Well, obviously, the process of negotiating the NDA was very onerous and oppressive, as has been covered in the press a lot. We had originally wanted to report Harvey to the police, get some internal investigation going at Miramax Films, but it quickly transpired that that was very difficult to do. Once we got pulled into the lawyer's office, all of it was really pretty coercive. We were locked in a office for long hours at a time. We were sometimes kept there till 5 a.m. They applied a lot of pressure on us, legal pressure and otherwise personal pressure. We were told that our friends and family wouldn't be safe. We were told that we wouldn't be safe unless we signed the NDA. So of course it was a pretty terrible feeling to sign it. I would say that we felt very powerless. I would say that we felt incredibly frustrated and angry that the legal system didn't stand up for women, young women. We basically felt disbelief, really, that he could get away with this kind of an agreement. I think it's quite public now that our agreement contained terms such as we wouldn't be permitted to talk to a doctor or a lawyer. We wouldn't even be able to keep a copy of our agreement. We wouldn't be able to seek any therapy. We basically had to forget about what happened. There was a list of our family and friends that had known that I worked for Harvey. And so Miramax Films would have kept a list of that friends and family and used them as a way of holding pressure over us.
Yeah, that sounds very terrible, and I'm very sorry that it happened. And you mentioned how you went to your friend, Zelda Perkins, who at the time was also the other assistant to Harvey Weinstein. What compelled you to go straight to her instead of like your close friends or family that you knew longer than you knew Zelda?
Well, actually, at the time that I went to Zelda, we were both away from home. We were both working as part of the Venice Film Festival. She was my direct superior. She had worked for Harvey for 4 years. I had merely worked for Harvey for 2 months. So actually, at the time that I went to talk to Zelda, I actually was asking for ways of dealing with Harvey. I had heard during the interview process that he was an incredibly difficult person to manage. There were lots of questions in the interview about had I worked for difficult bosses before, how I reacted to situations, and so on and so forth. I did not believe that Harvey Weinstein employed bright women with great futures from top universities in order to sexually assault them. I didn't believe that was possible. I did believe that he was a lecherous person and that this was the 1990s. The film industry was a very difficult place to navigate. A lot of us assistants, whilst we didn't think we were going up to the hotel room, to be sexually assaulted, we knew that as part of our work, it was really a question of fending people off, of saying no a lot, of dressing properly, of never being seen, in a bar, never drinking alcohol, never wearing clothes that might be a bit suggestive. And I think that's interesting because in the light of the Me Too movement and where things have moved in the present day, I look back on those days in the 90s, and I think in some ways the system was set up to be very victim blaming, as it was always our fault as assistants. It was our job to manage Harvey, to make sure that he didn't get out of control or he didn't behave improperly. And I think broader than that, broader than Harvey, back in those days in the workplace, it was often women's jobs to manage men and their lecherous behavior or their unfortunate comments, or there was very little responsibility given to powerful men to manage themselves. It was the younger women who often had much less power and worked as their assistants or secretaries or managed their travel and so on, who managed the men. And I think that's a very interesting perspective. I hope that this new generation will begin to look at things differently, and that the workplace is changing in the light of what the Me Too movement has done.
Yes, and I think this Me Too movement has impacted many, especially those in the workforce. And in your interview with the SF Chronicle Datebook, you mentioned how that many people, like especially women, like they're more easily being like coerced to being quiet because they're going up against someone who's more superior, specifically a male power figure in their workforce. What do you think, like what kind of measures can be taken to ensure that there's a more even power dynamic, especially now with like more upcoming future generations?
Yes, that's right. I did mention that indeed recently in the San Francisco Chronicle, but even 3 years ago, when I first broke my story, I talked in my New York Times op-ed about 4 power abuses. And I think for me, for my personal situation, there were certainly these 4. One of them was, of course, that Harvey was my boss and I was an assistant. So in the structure of Miramax Films, he was incredibly powerful. As Lauren O'Connor has said in her memo, the balance of power in this company is Harvey Weinstein 10, me 0. And I think that applied for every assistant that worked at Miramax Films. And then there was the fact that he was male and I was female. I mean, he weighed 3 times my weight. So people, perhaps detractors of the Me Too movement will say things like, well, why didn't you run? Why didn't you scream? I think that they didn't understand the fear of being trapped alone in a room that was intended to be your office with someone that's 3 times bigger than you. Actually, at that point, self-preservation kicks in and you think, I can't make him angry because I've seen him throw people across a room. So in order to get out, I have to talk my way out of this. I can't fight. So that is a very terrifying position, I think. Then there is the fact that Harvey had a great deal of money. And he used this money to sort of click his fingers and say, oh, I have the White House in my pay. I have the New York Times in my pay. There's nobody outside of my sphere of influence. And I indeed saw him call very powerful people and very powerful household names, and household names would do exactly what he wanted. So I think I definitely felt that dynamic also. And the final dynamic, which I've also spoken about quite a lot, of course, is race. Harvey had said to me, I like Chinese girls because they're discreet, meaning that I like Chinese girls because they don't complain. And there definitely was that element of younger girls of any race, did what they were told, or they lost their jobs, and there would be 20, 30 other young women from top schools, willing to take their position. But I think that also being an Asian woman in particular, part of the culture I experienced growing up was very much to keep your head down, to not to rock the boat, to, get a respectable career, be a credit to your parents and so on and so forth. So I think there definitely was a culture where Chinese women did not speak out about sexual assault, or indeed anything that, seemed to be complaining. So I think there were a number of dynamics at play that made that very difficult. I think your question is, to what extent do I feel the Me Too movement has changed those dynamics?
Yes.
To be honest, I would say that I don't think those dynamics are very pernicious, and they have gone on for a long time, over generations. I don't think that those dynamics are going to change in overnight, and not even in the 5 years since the Me Too movement has started. I think we have begun to bring these things into a public forum where they're now openly discussed. And I really hope that that is a start of making change about these sorts of things. But in terms of your actual question about how we redress the balance of power in workplaces, for example, what that really requires is more than just a cultural and societal change. That's going to take stuff like legal and political change. And that is actually very difficult to enact. So the Me Too movement certainly started as a cultural change. As I said, we're bringing these conversations into workplaces, in terms of society. These kinds of conversations are taking place in the press, and that's very encouraging. What we want to see, though, is policy in workplaces being changed, and that's much more difficult to enact. So, some of us survivors have been working to change law in places like the UK, the US. By the US, I mean it's very hard to enact federal law in this area. So we've been working in areas of state law. So, for example, one particular aspect of the law is to change the use of NDAs as a tool to cover up sexual assault in the workplace. That's pretty specific. So certain laws have been enacted now in New York, New Jersey, California. So we like to see some of the more progressive states coming forward with those types of changes in law. I think it'll be a long time before we see that happen in all states. I think it'll be a very long time before we see that being enacted into federal law. So I would say that we actually have a very long journey to tread, and that we're only at the very beginning of that journey in terms of really making change.
Yes, I totally agree. And I see all these changes happening. And as someone who is also like a minority, like an Asian American, a Chinese American, a female, it's definitely like really empowering to see these movements standing to make a change. And you mentioned earlier that Harvey Weinstein like was looking for an Asian girl. How did it feel to you personally knowing that he selected you because of your race and your gender, essentially?
It actually happened a little differently from that. Harvey, in a very, again, pernicious and really quite disgusting way, had told Zelda Perkins that he didn't, quote, do Jews or Chinese, meaning he didn't mess with Jews or Chinese, he wasn't attracted to them. Zelda really was on a mission to protect assistants younger than herself.
Mm-hmm.
She knew that Harvey was difficult to handle. She didn't want to be placing anyone in danger. So interestingly, she went out and recruited somebody who was Chinese, thinking that Harvey wouldn't mess with this person. And of course,
Mm-hmm.
that's ridiculous because Harvey was really being a master manipulator.
Yeah.
And in the end, he said to me that he felt Chinese girls were discreet, which is code really for I don't think you're going to complain about what happens in this
Mm-hmm.
hotel room. So it was kind of a mixture of things. And of course, my race very much played into this idea that I was going to be quiet and subservient, and I was going to be an obedient assistant who wasn't going to complain about things happening to me. And I think that is I mean I'm almost speechless. I mean, it's an appalling use of race, of course, as a tool of oppression. Not only are Chinese people in general oppressed enough, not only are Chinese women in general oppressed enough. I mean, it takes an incredible amount of effort, willpower, and to go against your parents and to be a young Chinese girl working in film in the first place. That's something that you have to work incredibly hard to get to. And then for that to be turned against you and for your very race to be used as a tool of oppression is, I mean, I mean, that's appalling. There's no
Mm-hmm.
other word for it.
Yeah, and I know at the time, like Harvey Weinstein's company, he was very well known, like you said earlier. He is this very big figure. Everyone knew him, everyone knew his films and everything. And you said in a couple of interviews also that you were very passionate about working in the film industry, especially at a very young age. But now when you're looking at it from like kind of like an older perspective, when this Me Too movement has started, when women are starting to find their voices, do you think now you would have sacrificed your connection to Harvey and essentially your job and link to the industry if you had known that there were these women who were more willing to speak up about what has happened, like containing sexual assault, sexual harassment, and rape? Or would you have still kept quiet?
I would really like to think that if this happened in 2022, that I would have had the courage to speak out, knowing that there were women around me who did speak out, not just about Harvey, but about many other men. Bill O'Reilly, Matt Lauer, Roger Ailes. There was a real reckoning of toxic, powerful men at the top who had abused women. So I'd like to think that as a junior woman in a firm, any kind of firm, not just film industry, not just a movie studio, but also corporations, in finance, in tech, and in other major sectors, I would very much like to think that women would speak out because they have a door that's now been opened to them, and really a tsunami of women that have come forward to speak about this type of allegations, including women of color. That said, I do want to emphasize that it is incredibly difficult as an individual. And I think that until you are in a position where you have been so oppressed by someone who's incredibly powerful, I think that it is easy to judge and say, oh no, but now we live in a new era and everyone should feel empowered to speak out. But actually, when you're in that position itself and you fear the loss of your job or the loss of your income or perhaps the loss of your reputation, or perhaps you even fear something just as simple as making your boss angry, it takes a great deal. And at that moment when you jump, you feel very alone. It doesn't matter that there are other women that have spoken about other men. At the moment you jump, you really are still on your own. And society and the legal system still doesn't particularly believe women. The burden of proof is on the woman who is making the accusations. That's that loaded word accuser, which is sometimes used in place of survivor. So the legal system does put the burden on the accuser or the survivor to prove their case. And that's often, obviously incredibly traumatic. It's incredibly re-triggering. You may not be in a position. It may be, as the book and the movie is named, a he said, she said moment, where there wasn't anyone else in the room. And it may be something that you can't actually prove, which doesn't mean it didn't happen.
Mhm. Yeah, and that's really powerful that like people sometimes don't take others' words for it, even though like there's no other way to describe it. And you mentioned a lot about how that like specifically minorities, they get shunned and they are not believed because they are part of the minority group. And in the film, She Said, you are portrayed in there, which is really cool to see that like another like minority Asian woman is being portrayed. And what is your opinion on more like in the film industry or just like in general, like what is the most important thing about giving minorities a voice that they like they won't have sometimes just because of the industry?
So even though it's my own story, and there's obviously a great deal of strangeness and weirdness about my own story being featured in a feature film like She Said, I at the same time have made an effort to kind of step back from all that weirdness and think, wow, it is actually something incredibly powerful that a diversity story is part of this movie. And not just part of this movie, but part of the broader Me Too movement. I think it's certainly been true that the Me Too, one of the criticisms of the Me Too movement is that it's very much centered around white narrative, in the sense that a lot of the stories, not all of the stories, but a lot of the stories have been from white survivors. And there isn't the diversity of content within the Me Too movement. I think that's really because it's often the case that women of color, whether they're from African or Asian heritages, are struggling to speak out about this very difficult subject. It's a vulnerable topic. There's a lot of guilt and shame still associated with speaking out as a sexual assault survivor. African and Asian communities that are very family based, may worry about bringing shame upon the family. These kinds of issues, really come to the fore. So I think that there have definitely been far fewer voices of color within the Me Too movement. And I don't take that to mean that women of color are not assaulted. In fact, I think it's the opposite. I think women of color are sometimes in jobs that are far more vulnerable. They might be working as waitresses, they might be working as hotel room cleaners, they might be working as nail salon technicians, they might not have English as their first language, they might be working on an hourly basis, they might be in this country illegally. And for all of those reasons, they are left extremely vulnerable. And so some of the nonprofit work that I have been doing in recent years has been around these incredibly vulnerable groups that targets women of color working in these industries where they are at great risk of sexual assault. And so I think that it is possibly true that whilst there are fewer diversity stories in the Me Too movement as a whole, the Me Too movement almost applies more to women of color, certainly within on an hourly, women in a lower income setting who are working on an hourly basis. Now, what are we actually going to do about that? At the moment, what is critical is that in the beginning, what is critical is this representation, that women of color who do have some kind of platform and a voice, and I count myself amongst that because of my Weinstein story, I've been able to get a platform and a voice I might not otherwise have had. I think it's really important to use that platform and a voice to show that Asian women can speak out about sexual assault and can be empowered. But then beyond the sort of positioning and representation, what is going to change beyond that? I am encouraged greatly by the work of a number of nonprofits that target specifically these types of communities where women are very vulnerable. I think to make change within a community really takes the community itself to start talking about it. I think it's very well that, big publications and the media show a lot of interest, and there's this big budget movie obviously happening at the moment. But is change really happening at the grassroots level within Indigenous communities? That's, kind of a question that really only community leaders within those communities and the NGOs that work within them can answer.
Yes, and it is great to see how passionate you are, like working to help those find their voices, which like you said, like this is a very sensitive topic. It can be very troublesome for many. And for those who are still struggling to find their voice, I know you go around working with these people to help them find their voice. But what do you think? Like, what is the message you want to spread to help these people find their voice?
I want to say that in 2017, 5 years ago, when Jodie Cantor came to my house and doorstopped my husband, it's a scene that features in the movie, and he first called me in the UK to talk to me about it. I will say that I was completely terrified, and I was absolutely adamant that I wasn't going to speak out. I think a number of factors played into that. My children at the time were very young. My youngest baby was only 6 months old. I was absolutely horrified at the idea that there might be impact on them, that they might be followed to school, that they might be harassed. Um, my parents and my sister didn't know about my story, and I did very much think about it in the context of my broader family and how it would affect them. And then a lot of my friends from my university days also didn't know about what happened. And I think it is devastating to find out someone that you cared about and were close to many decades ago had a terrible thing or went through a terrible thing, and you weren't able to be there for them, or that they didn't confide in you. So I think the emotional implications were quite enormous. And then there was also obviously the legal implications, the fear of speaking out about your NDA and the legal retaliation and the financial retaliation that might follow. I also thought, well, the New York Times has people like Gwyneth Paltrow or Ashley Judd who are far more famous than me, and they're far more used to speaking out. They already have a platform and a voice, and I don't understand why somebody who is not known, I was going to say little known, but in fact not known at all, not in any way a household name, not an actress, I'm not an activist, I don't in any way have a platform or even any experience in speaking out. And so I thought very much that my own voice didn't matter. It wasn't actually until I went through this long journey, which took 2 years. And then I agreed to be featured in the She Said book. And I went on the NBC Today show where I broke my story in front of 4 million people. That it wasn't actually until after I broke that story that I truly understood the power of the one voice. Uh, Almost on the day that I broke my story on this breakfast show, Asian survivors whom had never told anyone of what happened to them started to write to me. And I started to hear from people who were maybe 70. And the person who had assaulted them was 100, or would be 100 if they were alive today. But the person who assaulted them was long dead, and their parents were long dead. And they felt that they couldn't or would never be able to talk to anyone that was there at the time or might remember or was part of what had happened to them, that they were alone. And so that they were sort of passing the baton on to me as a daughter or as a granddaughter. And then I also heard from people who were 24, just like I was when I was starting out in the film industry, saying, I'm Asian, I'm 24, I now work in the film industry. I can't handle my boss. He makes me work late. Terrible things are happening in the office while I work late. And I had empowered some of those people to go and report their bosses to HR, or to go and tell their parents, or to seek some form of accountability. And so I suddenly realized that, wow, the power of one voice, even be it a small voice, even be it a super terrified voice, even be it a voice of somebody who's not well known, can actually make a difference. And so I feel like I say this all the time, but whether you consider yourself a person of some influence, whether have higher income or lower income, whether you are, whatever color you are, but particularly if you are a woman of color, do speak out. Don't think your voice doesn't matter. One voice can make a difference. Even if you just reach one other person, if you speak out, it's worth doing.
And that is a very powerful statement. And I'm sure that's going to resonate with so many people and help so many people find their own voices. And you mentioned before how the mental struggle of knowing that you can't go to people anymore. You can't go to even a doctor. You can't go to the people who you trusted the most in your life. Like, what did you do to overcome that mental battle? Because, like, obviously for 20 years, you were just alone. And then now seeing that you can come out, you can say your story. Like, how did you reach that point?
At that time, when Zelda Perkins and I signed our NDAs, we were 24 and 25 respectively. We had no recourse, as you mentioned. So we really didn't have any choice. It was I think that we thought when we walked away, and indeed our lawyers told us when we walked away, that we are drawing a line under an unfortunate episode. They often tell women who sign NDAs this. You can sign the NDA and it draws a line under something terrible that happened to you, and you can get on with your life. Actually, it's well-meaning, but that's an absolute lie. You never walk away and truly get on with your life. Of course, it haunts you. I moved to Hong Kong and tried to commit suicide twice. Zelda Perkins moved to Guatemala and worked with horses for 5 years. It doesn't really leave you. In practice, what could we do? Nothing, because we were condemned to this silence. So essentially what we had to do was to try to bury it. Our own lawyer told us that we should treat this time in our lives as a black hole. And that's what I did. I never referred to it. As you know from our story, I didn't speak to my husband of 10 years. We were married for 10 years, had 4 kids. I never mentioned this because we were legally obliged, as well as personally obliged, not to speak about it at all. So we tried the whole, going away and not talking about it. Fortunately, society understands trauma a lot better these days. We know that there is no such thing as drawing a line. You can't just walk away. You can't treat this time in your life as a black hole, as my lawyer, who was very well-meaning and on my side, told me, because that's absolutely impossible. And I think that some education for both culture and society around the idea of trauma, and that trauma takes a long time to overcome, and that trauma that is in darkness actually thrives rather than is healed, is a really important notion. And I think the fact that society now is coming to a place where it understands that better is very important.
Yes, and that is definitely also something that I think many people need to hear, especially when they are struggling and in this so-called black hole. And you mentioned how you moved to Hong Kong and you were going through some tough times. Like, what did that silence mean to you personally?
I found the silence incredibly oppressive. I think the idea that we couldn't speak to professionals, but also that we were cut off from the people in our lives. I'm constantly being asked, how did it feel not to tell your husband of 10 years with whom you had 4 children? And I actually turn that question around and I say, never mind how it felt not to tell my husband of 10 years. Let's start with the 24-year-old who couldn't continue to talk to the people then who she'd already confided in. So, there was a list of people that we had already talked to. And on my list, it listed number 1, my boyfriend, number 2, my best friend, number 3, a couple of my colleagues, number 4, a lawyer that I talked. But there was a long list of people who already knew about what happened. And I think that the idea that we were already shut off from them, even though they knew what happened, is really quite shocking. It means that you can't, even in the darkness of your own room, in a whisper conversation on the phone, really seek any kind of comfort. And I think that sort of shutting people away in that way is incredibly damaging.
It is, and I'm very happy that you moved forward. You're where you are today because you've managed to battle through all those trauma. You found a way to come to the light. You found the light, essentially. And it is also being shown through this book and through this film, She Said. And like the She Said film, it is part of this Me Too movement. And what do you hope that this film can do to progress forward this movement?
Absolutely. That's a great question. I'm often being asked things like, well, you've done over 200 television interviews. There's a book. So what will the movie bring that previously all the work that we've done over the last 5 years or 3 years won't? And I think the answer is simple. I think that the movie actually has a huge emotional impact. That even the book, as wonderfully written as it is, and in the detail that it is, and the astonishing feat that the book is, and even every television interview, including interviews with Panorama, or interviews with BBC News Now, interviews with 60 Minutes, what they don't convey is the actual emotion of what happened. Because I found it very interesting that as a real life survivor, I mean, these events actually happened to me, and I've been on shows like BBC Newsnight or 60 Minutes and given very detailed accounts of real life what happened to me. And yet people who watch those interviews, or even my own immediate friends and family who now do know what happened to me, sat in the movie and they still cried. It still had an incredible emotional impact, even on the people who were there at the time, who knew what happened, who follow my interviews. There's something different about something being dramatized and the actual raw emotion of the events that happened to 2 pretty young women being reenacted on screen. And so I hope a few things for the movie. I hope that that emotional impact will drive home the continuing importance of the Me Too movement. I hope the movie will reach a broader audience than the book and the television interviews do. As wonderful and erudite as the book and the interviews are, they reach a certain portion of the population. I think a film reaches a far wider base. And I think that's important because I think there are people still who haven't heard about the Me Too movement, who don't know what happened in the Weinstein story. And I think the movie will open up new audiences for us.
That's awesome to hear. And I personally haven't seen the movie yet, but I am so excited to go watch it. And I can't wait to also see part of your story in it. And to kind of wrap up, like for my last question, I'm gonna kind of end it on a more fun note. What is like it's gonna sound like, okay, I know this movie, it's like it touches on a very sensitive topic, but what is your favorite part essentially in the movie, either coming from like a film industry perspective or just personally to you?
I've got to say, my favorite part is my husband's scene, of course. He's really the most important
Yes.
person in the movie. I joke about that because I think what one fun aspect actually of this film, one cheering aspect of the film is, although it's a film that has been made by women and is predominantly being watched by women, although I certainly hope men see it as well. You know, Dee Gardner, the producer, Rebecca Lenkovitz, the writer, Maria Schrader, the director, and then of course Carey Mulligan and Zoe Kazan, who are the lead stars. I mean, these are all incredibly powerful women who are very passionate about this subject, and they've made an incredible movie. But I think the fun bit is there are supporting husbands. They're supporting husbands throughout the thing. There's Jodie's husband, there's Megan's husband, there's my husband, and they all actually bring some comedy and lightheartedness. Actually, there's a great moment where Megan's husband is absolutely astonished that she's got Donald Trump on the phone. I mean, his eyes are literally out on stalks. There's another comic moment where Jodie is speaking to Rose McGowan and she's given her daughter the Netflix password and she's hiding in the room watching TV, and the husband comes through the door and says, "Where are you?" And then there is some comedy, of course, in the fact that my husband is cleaning out the minivan with a vacuum cleaner, which is actually what he was doing. He was actually sweeping Cheerios out the back of our minivan when Jodie Cantor came up to talk to him. And I love a moment outside the LA premiere, a real life moment, where my husband ran into Jodie Cantor's real life husband, Ron. And Ron said to my husband, "Oh, you're the driveway guy."
Whoa. Well, I'm very happy that your husband is now recognized as the driveway guy. I
He's
think,
never going to live it down.
oh, for sure.
He
He's gonna be
might be
known
a
all
Silicon
across.
Valley exec, but really he's known as the driveway guy.
He'll be known all throughout Hollywood. He'll just be seen on the streets and be called the driveway guy.
That's right.
Well, thank you so much, Rowena, for taking the time to talk with me more about your journey, about your voice, and most importantly, taking time to share your story for those who are looking for inspiration to find theirs.
Of
I've been
course.
Ingrid Lee, and I've been reporting for BRJL 103.